Good morning, dear students. Today we are having a lecture on the subject country study, and today we are going to focus on British history. In the framework of our lecture, we are going to look at the following points: early times, the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, and the 20th century. So let's start with early times. It is important to remember that while ancient civilizations flourished in Africa and Asia, then in Greece and Rome, life in Britain was still primitive. And in the history of world civilizations, Britain was a very late starter. A new and important page of British history was opened up by the arrival of the Celts from Central Europe after 800 BC. The Celts are important for the British history because they introduced an early form of agriculture, their tribal organization. They are the ancestors of many of the people in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and Cornwall. In AD, the Romans occupied Britain because they had a better trained army. The Romans brought the skills of reading and writing to Britain, and they left four things of importance behind. Their roads, the sites of important cities, the traces of their language and culture, and the seeds of Christianity. The Anglo-Saxons and Jutes began to settle in Britain after AD 430. They gave the larger part of Britain its new name, England. The Saxons divided the land into new areas based on shires or counties. They introduced a three-field pattern of farming. The Angles developed a class system made up of kings, lords, soldiers, and workers on the land. The Anglo-Saxons had a little use of towns and cities, but they had a great effect on the countryside, where they introduced new farming methods and founded thousands of self-sufficient villages with rich landowners. Britain experienced another wave of Germanic invasions. In the 8th century, these invaders were Vikings, or in other words, Norsemen or Danes. They came from Scandinavia, and in the 9th century they conquered and settled in the extreme north and west of England and some coastal regions of Ireland. They acted like pirates. They robbed the country and left it, and then started to conquer one territory after another. They burned churches and monasteries in Britain and Ireland. And by 875, King Alfred of Wessex was the first to hold out against the Vikings. He understood that the best way to keep off the Danes was by fighting them at sea, and so he built ships bigger and faster than the Danes. And that's why he is considered to be the founder of the English fleet. He is also important as a lawgiver because he compiled and published a code of laws from earlier laws. In 1066, the Normans defeated the English in a battle near Hastings, and William of Normandy, or William the Conqueror, was crowned King of England in 1066. A new period had begun, and the Norman invaders brought their language with them too. They spoke a Norman dialect of French, and it became the tongue of court circles, administration, and the official language of the state. Latin was a language of the church and learning, whereas ordinary people who could speak neither French nor Latin spoke the vernacular English, Middle English. So medieval times saw bitter clashes. One of them between England and Scotland. England tried to defeat Scotland, but the Scots created a popular resistance movement, Scottish resistance. And England lost practically all its lands in France during the Hundred Years' War. And in the country itself, there was no peace because there was a feudal struggle between noble families. And the feudal struggle grew into an open war, the War of the Roses. And the result of the war was the fact that Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, was proclaimed King of England. And by the end of the 15th century, England was one of a number of countries where elements of bourgeois economy were developing. So the 16th century is always associated with two persons, Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I, the Tudor period. Henry VIII was known for his love of hunting, sport, and music. He was cruel and wasteful with money, and he disliked power of the church in England because the church was some kind of an international organization and he could not completely control it. And the power of the Catholic Church in England worked against Henry's authority. Henry had another reason for opposing to the authority of the church because he wanted to marry his new love Anne Boleyn, and he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. He asked the Pope to allow him to divorce Catherine, but the Pope forbade the divorce and refused to do it. And in 1531, the Church of England was established in the country, the Anglican Church. Henry VIII became the head of the church, and under the Act of Supremacy passed by the Parliament, Henry was free to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. This break was purely political. I mean the break with Rome, because Henry simply wanted to control the church and to keep its wealth in his own kingdom. Elizabeth I. Elizabeth's reputation is incredibly high in her country, and her reign, the Elizabethan era, is named the Golden Age in the British history. And when Elizabeth died, one of the great epochs of English history ended. Her 45-year rule decisively shaped the future of England as a stable monarchy, governed through the cooperation of crown and local elites. And the Protestant religion was established as England's faith, When she died in 1603, James VI, the King of Scotland, became King of England, James I. The 17th century, maybe the stormiest period in the British history. Charles I, the son of James I, declared war on Parliament, and the Civil War had started. Parliament was supported by the navy, by most of the merchants, and by the population of London. And it controlled the most important national and international sources of wealth. And in 1645, the Royalist army was finally defeated. The strongest commander of the parliamentarians was Oliver Cromwell, and from 1649 till 1660, Britain was a republic. But it was not a success because Cromwell established a military dictatorship. He created a government far more severe than Charles's had been, and his efforts to govern the country through the army were extremely popular. And when he died in 1658, Charles II was invited to return to his kingdom. The republic was over. But Parliament was now beyond question more powerful than the king and would remain so. The Bill of Rights was written in 1689, and the king was now unable to raise taxes or keep an army without the agreement of Parliament, or to act against any MP for what he said or did in Parliament. In 1701, Parliament finally passed the Act of Settlement to make sure only a Protestant could inherit the crown. And in 1707, Union of Scotland and England was completed by Act of Parliament. And from that moment, both countries no longer had separate parliaments. So the 18th century is mainly associated with the Industrial Revolution, and it's true. By the middle of the 18th century, industry began to use coal for changing iron ore into good quality iron or steel, and this laid the foundation for the Industrial Revolution. This made Britain the leading iron producer in Europe. Increased iron production made it possible to manufacture new machinery for other industries. And in the middle of the century, other countries were buying British uniforms, equipment, and weapons for their armies. And the industry most often associated with the Industrial Revolution is the textile industry. A series of extraordinary innovations reduced and then replaced the human labor required to make cloth. So the social consequences of the Industrial Revolution were dramatic and far-reaching because the English society was breaking up into two basic classes: the owners of the factories, the capitalists, and the workers, the proletarians. While the owners gained profits, the working conditions were terrible and the wages were very small. and thousands of peasants became landless and ruined and were forced to migrate to the growing towns where they were consumed by the growing industry. So, the 19th century. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, Britain became the workshop of the world because British factories were producing more than any other country in the world. And Britain's empire had first been built on trade and the need to defend this against rival European countries. Britain watched the oceans carefully to make sure its trade routes were safe and fought wars in order to protect its areas of interest. Having many colonies, Britain controlled large areas of the world. The British had a strong feeling of their importance. In 1837, Victoria was crowned as a British Queen. She and her husband Albert came to symbolize many virtues: a close-knit family life, a sense of public duty, integrity, and respectability, and these beliefs and attitudes are often known as Victorian. Queen Victoria is associated with Britain's great age of industrial expansion, economic progress, and especially the growth of the colonial empire. At her death, Britain had a worldwide empire on which the sun never set, and the word Victorian began to employed to express a new self-consciousness both in relation to the nation and to the period through which it was passing. So let's come to the 20th century, and several great events happened within the century. Let's look at them. The First World War. World War I was primarily a European conflict with many facets: immense human sacrifice, stalemate trench warfare, and the use of new devastating weapons: tanks, aircraft, machine guns, poison gas, U-boats. The war was the catalyst for the Bolshevik Russian Revolution, which would inspire later communist revolutions in a number of countries, and would lay the basis for the Cold War. World War II, World War II was a truly global conflict with many facets: immense human suffering, and the use of the atom bomb. The conflict began on September the 1st, 1939, due to the German invasion of Poland, and lasted until summer of 1945, involving many of the world countries. About 50 million people died as a result of the war. And this figure includes acts of genocide, incredibly bloody battles in Europe and Pacific Ocean, and the atomic bombings of the two cities in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, an important feature of post-war politics is the creation of the United Nations Organization in order to protect peace and democracy in the world and prevent new wars. Britain became member of the Security Council, but from the very start this new world organization faced great difficulties, because the idea of the four allies, the Soviet Union, the United States, France and Britain working together for the recovery of Central Europe did not work, and Europe afterwards became divided into the eastern part under the Soviet control and the western part under the control of Britain, France, and the United States. The post-war years saw the end of the British colonial empire, and in many countries having been the colonies of the British Empire, the national liberation movement broke out, and it led to the loss of the empire. When talking about the 20th century in the British history, we can't do without mentioning the Thatcher decade. Margaret Thatcher was the first woman prime minister in British and European history, and she was the first prime minister to win 3 terms in office, and she had been the prime minister for 11 years. And these years were economic boom years in Britain. The living standards in Britain rose, and the rate of unemployment gradually ended. But the most serious accusation against the Thatcher government by the middle of the 1980s was that it had created a more unequal society, a society of two nations, one wealthy and the other poor. And one of the most crucial developments in post-war Europe is the emergence of the European Union. Britain joined the European Union on January the 1st, 1973, and Britain has remained one of the most Eurosceptic countries of the European Union, and recently it has left the European Union and lost its membership in this organization. And Britain cannot make up its mind whether its first loyalty is to Europe or to the United States. Britain feels its special relationships with the United States because it rests on a common language, on its wartime alliance with the United States and the Cold War which followed it. And Britain sided with the United States in other foreign policy matters too, which alarmed its European partners. For example, in 1986, it allowed US aircraft to use British airfields from which to attack the Libyan capital Tripoli, or in 1996 to bomb Yugoslavia, or later in 2003 to bomb Iraq. So that's all I was going to tell you about the British history. I hope you found the material of the lecture interesting and informative. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.